Hey everybody. So this is the first in a series of videos that I'm going to be doing about the F word. The other F word, the word that shall not be named in polite conversation. The word that if you use it, people are going to assume that you're an unserious person, or maybe that you're prone to emotionalism or hysteria. And you probably saw by the title of the video, I'm talking about the word fascist, of course. And I completely understand why people shy away from using that term, because it does get misused and it gets misapplied all the time. And I think that when we use it incorrectly, when we misapply it, it's like the tactical nuclear warhead of political debate. Once you launch it, you've ruled out any peaceful resolution of the conflict. But I do want to talk about it because I think it's important. And when we understand fascism, and especially what you're going to hear from me, especially when we understand fascist tactics, I think it helps to explain a lot of what we're seeing in our nation today. Even though we're not living in a full-blown fascist regime, certainly not. If we understand the tactics that we're experiencing, I think it allows us to draw on some lessons from the past for how people have resisted those sorts of tactics in the past. And the thing is, if we don't use the term just because we're being polite, or maybe because we might be afraid that we're using it incorrectly, I think it only makes it easier for some of the worst people in America to use those tactics. And believe me, we do have a lot more people in this country who lean in that direction than I think a lot of us want to admit. So if you want to see a very current example of this, you can watch the recent debate that Mehdi Hasan had with 20 young people who all referred to themselves as part of the far right. And I'll link to that video down below. But within the first 15 minutes, you'll meet Connor, and Connor is going to blow your mind. What you'll see is that at least some portion of our nation is completely okay with using fascist tactics to gain power, and they're comfortable even calling themselves fascists. And it's disturbing to watch, but it's real. And if you listen to what Connor says, that'll introduce you to some of the themes that I'm going to be addressing in this series. But Connor and his friends aren't alone. In my own work over the past few years, I've come across several what I would call pseudo-Christian movements that openly embrace fascist ideas and methods. Like if you read Stephen Wolfe's book, The Case for Christian Nationalism, I mean, you're going to find that it's incredibly dumb. It's scholarly sounding, but it's an incredibly dumb defense of a system that's fascist through and through, but with a bunch of pretentious appeals to reformed theologians from hundreds of years ago, and very few appeals to scripture, surprisingly enough, for what it's worth. And I get it. You might read Wolfe's book or watch an interview with him and just be tempted to think, well, this is just a sad and troubled guy. And he's just saying these things because he's trying to get back at the cute girl who rejected him in high school, or the athlete who shoved him inside a locker, or the teacher who didn't realize that he was the smartest kid in the class. And sure, on some level, you'd be absolutely right. That's usually the origin story for the Stephen Wolfes of the world. But sadly, in this case, it's far worse than that. He wrote a dumb book, sure, but only because it's impossible to write a smart book on such an insane premise. But Stephen Wolfe is a West Point graduate. He's not a stupid person. And Doug Wilson, and this is very important, Doug Wilson, who published that dumb book, is also not a stupid person. And he leads a group of militantly right-wing churches that are based in Moscow, Idaho. And that group of churches is growing. And here's where it gets kind of chilling. Pete Hegseth, who's still our Secretary of Defense as of this recording, that Pete Hegseth is a member of one of Doug Wilson's churches, the one in Nashville. And things start to get real when we realize that Pete Hegseth, our nation's defense secretary for now, is part of the movement that published The Case for Christian Nationalism. And Pete Hegseth's right-wing pseudo-Christian pastor is leading Bible studies at the Pentagon. So I find that troubling, and I mean it when I say if we don't pay attention to this stuff, then we're just giving these people free rein to just do their thing. So anyway, if you want to know how I started to talk about all this stuff, I was an evangelical pastor for 20 years and a conservative Republican my whole life until Donald Trump. But when I retired from pastoral ministry in 2016, I started paying attention again to the political news for the first time in years. And I was appalled, and I've been appalled ever since, at the way Donald Trump and his MAGA movement have co-opted much of the Christian church in America. I saw that Trump and his allies were using Christians as a cover to advance the most anti-Christian political movement in my lifetime. So I started writing books and making videos like this one to raise an alarm. So this series fits into that larger project. It's the result of years of just trying to talk to people about what we're all seeing and years of trying to name things correctly, because I hope you'll agree that if we can't properly name the methods and tactics that a movement that I think is a malicious movement might be using to hook people, then we won't even begin to know how to resist those methods and those tactics. And so that leads me to the first important thing that I want you to know about this series. I'm going to be talking about how fascist tactics work, what they look like, the methods that fascist adjacent leaders use to seize power and to keep it. Because whether we want to admit it or not, those methods work, whatever name we give them. And as a former pastor, it's been disconcerting for me to realize that these methods especially seem to work to hook traditionally minded people, people who placed a lot of value on an ordered society, people who notice a lot of cultural things that they might not appreciate. So they might want things to go back to the way that they imagine they might have been in the past. And honestly, that describes a lot of conservative religious people of many kinds. But in America, in this context, those people often tend to be Christians. So like I said, those fascist methods work. But just seeing the use of one method or another doesn't make an entire regime a fascist regime. So like take the use of propaganda. That's a fascist method. But it's also just a general authoritarian method. And not all authoritarians are fascist authoritarians. If we want to resist the system that's doing so much damage to our society, I think it's important to know how that whole system works. So regarding propaganda, or the whole notion of unreality, the fact that Trump has told thousands of documented lies and that Fox News amplifies those lies out to millions of people every day, that in and of itself doesn't make Trump or Fox News fascist. But the use of propaganda is a fascist tactic. And if we see it getting combined with other fascist tactics, like making regular appeals to some mythic past, or creating a strong us versus them dynamic in the culture, or using heightened rhetoric around law and order, or the demonization of immigrants, and a whole bunch of other tactics, the more that we see those tactics working together as a system, the more that we can confidently identify those things as fascist tactics, and the more that we can combat them as such. But this is important. I'm talking about methods and tactics in this series. I'm not calling the Trump administration a capital F fascist regime. We're not there yet, and I hope we never get there. And I'm doing this because I believe we can defeat those tactics as long as we're clear-eyed about what we're seeing. Now, I'm not going to even pretend to be an expert on any of this, but I do care about it. As someone who spent 20 years pastoring people in the evangelical church, I see the damage that it does to people when they get swept up in movements like Trump's MAGA movement that use at least fascist adjacent tactics. The MAGA movement ruins people's lives because it's a depraved system. And to the extent that it calls itself Christian, it's based on a depraved theology. And that's going to be true forever about the MAGA movement, whether we end up calling it a fascist movement or not. But to the extent that Trump and his movement do use fascist methods to draw people in, to the extent that they try to turn traditional-minded Christians into an angry populist mob, to the extent that they try to turn Christians into an unthinking political weapon that Trump can wield against his enemies, to the extent that Trump is doing all of that using old methods that others have learned how to oppose, I do want to learn as much as I can about those methods because they're diabolical. And I want to learn to defeat those tactics at every turn. And like I said, I'm no expert, but I'll reference a lot of books along the way. So we can all read these books and learn from them. And the first one that I'm going to recommend, because it's going to be prominent throughout this series, is Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works. Stanley lays out what he calls the 10 tactics of fascism. So those and several others are going to show up in these videos again and again. So here's where this series is going, though. My main point today is that we have to be able to talk about this issue. We can't be afraid to name what we're seeing. We just need to do it well. So in the next video, I'll share several definitions of fascism that scholars have put forward so we can have a shared understanding of what we're talking about. People often shut down conversations about it by saying, no one even agrees on what that word means. And I get that. But what we'll see is that when we look at all the definitions, we do see a pretty clear pattern. And we can actually have some meaningful conversations about it. And then in the videos after that, I'm going to lay out Jason Stanley's 10 tactics of fascism and others, and I'll go into some detail on each one of them. And I'm going to use examples from history and examples from today. And the reason I'm doing all that is so eventually, once we've established a shared vocabulary around these things, we might be able to hold Trump's actions or the actions of his people up to the light and measure those actions against what we're learning here. We need to make it okay to talk about those things without misusing terms, because when we misuse terms, it just hurts our credibility, but also without being easily dismissed if we try to raise legitimate warnings about what we're seeing. So finally, I do just want to emphasize this once more. It's not helpful to try to prove that any regime is a full-blown fascist regime. What's helpful is to learn to recognize patterns so we can come against those patterns and not let them work, not let them gain power. Historians really only agree that we've ever seen two full-blown fascist regimes in history. That's Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany. And then many will also include Franco's Spain as the third on that list. And some will throw in a few other regimes that had a lot of fascist characteristics, but really the three big capital F fascist regimes in history were led by Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco. And we need to be careful not to overstate the case about Trump's MAGA movement, because we just lose credibility if we do that. So I'm calling this series, Are We Fascist Yet?, as a little bit of a humorous way, I guess, of saying up to this point, we're not living under a fascist regime. But wow, look at how hard they're working to use some of these tactics. So let's name those tactics and let's call those tactics out and let's learn to resist those tactics the best way that we can. So thanks for listening.